A simple woman quietly stepped into the Grand Carrington estate, holding a small, upbone, neatly wrapped gift, her dress plain, her expression calm but within moments. Whispers turned to sneers, and laughter morphed into humiliation. "Is that the adopted one?" someone murmured behind a crystal flute. "I thought she was one of the staff." A guest chuckled, loud enough for others to join in. Her mother, elegant in a tailored Chanel suit, narrowed her eyes and muttered, "Don't embarrass us again with your presence." She stood there, near the marble pillars that reached toward the glittering chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, gripping her gift like a lifeline. No jewelry adorned her neck, no designer logo on her clutch, and just as her father pointed toward the service entrance with a sneer on his lips, the double doors behind her burst open. A storm of black suits, polished shoes, and presence stronger than the architecture itself swept into the room. Her billionaire husband, Lucas Hale, the most powerful man in New York, strode in, scanning the crowd with eyes that held no tolerance for pretense. And when he saw her, standing small and forgotten in that room full of arrogance, his entire being shifted. He walked straight to her and kissed her hand like royalty. Just 7 minutes later, a chain of events began that no one at the Carrington estate could have imagined. What happened next not only shattered the Carrington legacy, it rewrote what legacy meant altogether. Stay with me, because this is not just a story of power or wealth. It's a story about truth and what happens when the one they thought least worthy becomes the one no one can live without. Before we dive deeper into what unfolded that unforgettable evening, comment below and let us know, where in the world are you watching this from? And if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, this is a story you need to hear. It started on a spring afternoon in Greenwich, Connecticut. The sky was clear, and the Carrington estate looked like something out of a European postcard, grand, silent, intimidating. The birthday versus celebration for Everett A. Carrington, the founding patriarch of Carrington Capital, was in full bloom. Wall Street titans mingled with senators. Media moguls laughed over champagne. And the air smelled like old money, power, and polished cruelty. And in the middle of this curated world walked Emily Carrington. Except most in the estate never truly called her that. She had grown up far from chandeliers and hedge fund conversations. In a modest Arizona town, with the scent of desert rain and secondhand textbooks, she learned to fight for every inch of her identity. At 18, a DNA test revealed the truth that upended everything. She wasn't the adopted daughter of a small-town couple, but the biological heir to one of the most powerful families in America. Yet, the Carringtons had not embraced her. No, they had tolerated her, a shadow of their mistake, a scar on their perfection. At 29, she was now married to Lucas Hale, but even that wasn't enough, because in this world of curated smiles and diamond-edged judgments, your worth wasn't measured by love, it was measured by legacy. And her legacy, to them, was a stain. She had arrived early, carrying a jade bracelet she'd found in a quiet Brooklyn antique shop, one she had saved for months to buy. The gift wasn't expensive by Carrington standards, but it was rare, meaningful, handpicked. She'd wrapped it herself, using brown craft paper and a satin ribbon. Not a luxury bag, no gold wax seal, just something real. The moment she entered the foyer, the shift in the room was palpable. It wasn't loud, but it was lethal. Glances sliced her like razors. A hedge fund manager, Richard Voss, grinned as he whispered, "That the adopted one looks like she wandered in from a thrift store." His words didn't need to be loud. They were meant to be heard, meant to sting. A woman in a Gucci gown leaned toward her friend and said with a smile that barely moved her face, "No jewelry, no name, no presence, practically invisible." Emily didn't flinch, not on the outside. She trained herself to hold the silence, to let the storm swirl around her while her hands stayed steady, but her heart pounded in her ears. Then came Vanessa Carrington, the golden granddaughter, the one raised in luxury, the one whose DNA had once been thought to be Emily's. Vanessa was everything the estate wanted to preserve: poised, icy, cruel. Her emerald dress shimmered as she approached Emily like a queen descending from marble stairs. You know, she said, loud enough for others to hear. If you're going to dress like the help, you should at least carry a tray. Laughter, echoing, cruel, unapologetic. Emily gripped the box tighter, her nails pressing into the ribbon. But she said nothing. A photographer passed by and glanced at her. You're not on the shot list, he said casually, as though reminding a stranger of the rules. Step aside. Even the staff joined in. Clara, a senior butler, pointed toward the side entrance. Miss, the kitchen is that way. Her words were laced with a smile so thin it was almost honest. Emily stood, silent, her face calm but her eyes burning. And then came the moment. Not the climax, but the foreshadowing. Someone bumped into her gift box, almost knocking it to the floor. She caught at it. Steady. One of the waiters smirked. Careful. Might be the only thing in here worth less than the napkins. Still, she said nothing, because she had something none of them saw coming. Power doesn't always enter the room with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence, and sometimes it walks through the door in a tailored charcoal suit, flanked by 3 bodyguards, carrying not just money but the truth. But that moment was still minutes away. Until then, Emily stood in the shadow of crystal chandeliers, a quiet woman in a black dress, an outsider, a flaw in the design, or so they thought, because what they didn't know was this: the estate's silence, their arrogance, and their laughter wasn't the climax of the story. It was the buildup. The question isn't whether Emily belonged there. The real question was, how long would it take before the Carringtons realized they no longer did? And that answer was about to arrive. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of every eye against you? Have you ever stood quietly while others laughed, not knowing the storm you carried in your silence? If so, you already know the beginning of this story, the end that you're not ready for. Let me show you. Emily had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. The drive from Brooklyn to Greenwich was long enough through 100 versions of Today and Day to play out in her head versions where she was welcomed, embraced even, as the long-lost daughter finally home, versions where her father's eyes softened, where her mother reached out, even if awkwardly, and where Vanessa gave a polite nod instead of sharpening her smile like a blade. But none of those daydreams survived the harsh chill of reality. And yet, Emily came anyway. Not out of naivety, not out of foolish hope, but out of principle. She had been raised to believe that family, no matter how fractured, still meant something, that showing up quietly, honestly, was a form of dignity. The car had dropped her off at the lower driveway, not because she was told to use it, but because years of conditioning had made her avoid the grand front whenever possible. She didn't want the spectacle. She never did. She just wanted to be seen as herself. The Emily who worked 3 jobs through college. The Emily who once taught math to underprivileged kids in a cramped public school classroom with peeling paint. The Emily who didn't need chandeliers or caviar to know her worth. But that version of Emily had no place in the Carrington household. Not according to the way they looked at her. So she didn't fight for attention. She arrived early, not to get a head start on socializing, but to place her gift on the table before the crowd arrived. She didn't want it to be about her. She wanted it to be about Everett. Her grandfather, though he rarely acknowledged her beyond a nod, still, he was the only one who hadn't explicitly rejected her. That was enough to earn her respect. She had picked the jade bracelet weeks ago. It was tucked away in the corner of an old antique shop on Flatbush Avenue, inside a dusty velvet-lined box. The shop owner, a Tibetan man with a soft voice and cataract-clouded eyes, had run his fingers along the edges and said, "This piece carries old truth. Someone will recognize it one day." Emily hadn't understood what he meant. She bought it because it reminded her of her grandmother, the woman she never got to meet but heard whispers of, a woman who loved simplicity and wore a similar jade bangle in old black and white photos. The wrapping was her own. She had tied the ribbon 3 times to make sure it held. It had to be perfect, not in luxury but in intention. No one noticed her place it on the table beside the towering gifts of Cartier and Bulgari. No one wanted to. She had retreated to a quiet spot near the grand staircase, thinking perhaps she could blend into the shadows without incident. That was, of course, Wishful thinking. Vanessa's entrance came like a siren wail, all sparkles and choreography. Her entourage followed 2 steps behind, cameras subtly clicking. She wasn't just a granddaughter, she was a brand. As Vanessa descended the staircase with a glass of champagne already in hand, her voice rang through the foyer. "Emily," she said with exaggerated surprise. "I didn't realize the school break was this week." There was no school break. It was just another jab, a reference to Emily's past career teaching at a charter school before marrying Lucas. Another reminder that in Vanessa's eyes, Emily was a charity case with an unfortunate claim to blood. Emily had smiled then, not warmly but with that tight composure she had mastered, just came to celebrate Everett. She said simply. Vanessa's smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened. Of course. How noble. The next 30 minutes were a slow burn, one by one. The guests arrived, and the whispers resumed. Emily stood her ground, occasionally sipping water, occasionally checking the time on her simple leather-strapped watch, not because she was anxious, but because Lucas was due soon. And Lucas, despite all the noise around her, was her anchor. Still, she did not want him to arrive as a rescue. She wanted to stand tall on her own. Every glance, every murmured insult was a test of her will. She passed each one without a word, but inside, something cracked a little deeper each time. Richard Voss had laughed openly when he spotted her near the appetizers. Did the dress code change to minimalism? He asked no one in particular. A few people laughed. Margaret Carrington, Emily's mother, simply turned her head, avoiding the scene. That was her habit. She didn't confront, she erased. At the edge of the ballroom, Edward Carrington, Emily's father, held court with a pair of senators and laughed boisterously about a recent business acquisition, pausing only to look at Emily once and say, "Did someone forget to collect coats at the door?" He hadn't seen her in months. That was his first remark. Still, Emily held the line, but her fingers tightened around her clutch. The jade box felt heavier with each insult. She had learned long ago that silence can be mistaken for weakness, but it can also be armor. Then came the moment no one but her noticed. A young waiter, no older than 19, bumped into her gently while serving a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He mumbled an apology. She smiled and helped him stabilize the tray. He glanced at her once more, unsure, and said quietly, "I don't think they deserve you," and walked away. It was nothing, and it was everything. For the first time in that room, someone had seen her, really seen her, not through the lens of scandal or social rank, just a moment of human recognition. She stood a little straighter after that, when Clara Holt, the senior butler, made her snide remark about the service entrance. Emily did not reply, but she did not move either, and something in her stillness made Clara blink first. There was power in not flinching. Then, as if on cue, Vanessa returned this time with a fresh tactic. She walked over to the gift table, lifting each gift delicately, inspecting labels and ribbons like a host at an auction. Then she reached Emily's box. "Oh," she said loudly. "Someone left a handmade gift." Guests turned. "How quaint," Vanessa added, lifting it with 2 fingers like it might stain her gown. Emily stepped forward not to defend, but to reclaim. "That's mine," she said, voice calm, unwavering. Vanessa held it out. "Should I find a shelf in the guest house for it?" Emily didn't blink. "Should I find a mirror so you can see yourself right now?" For one breathless second, Vanessa's face stilled, and then the crowd murmured. It wasn't loud, but it was the first ripple. Emily took the box gently from her and walked away, not toward the service entrance, not toward the shadows, but into the light of the center floor. She placed the gift back on the table deliberately, without apology, and when she turned, for the first time, she saw her grandfather Everett sitting quietly near the end of the ballroom, his gaze fixed on her, not cold, not amused, just watching. That moment, too, mattered, not because he said anything, but because he didn't look away. The music swelled, the chatter rose, the evening spun onward, but something had shifted. Not in them, in her. She was done surviving the Carringtons. It was time they began surviving her. The string quartet had just shifted into a delicate arrangement of Vivaldi When Emily slipped past the edge of the ballroom toward the garden veranda, she needed a moment not to cry, not to crumble, but to breathe. Her heart wasn't fragile. It was simply tired. Tired of holding its shape beneath the constant pressure of ridicule wrapped in politeness. Tired of absorbing insult after insult like rainfall on stone. The evening was only beginning. Yet it already felt like she had stood through a monsoon of judgment. The manicured hedges beyond the glass doors offered temporary relief from the suffocating opulence inside. She stepped out, letting the cool spring air steady her thoughts. The garden was lit softly, lanterns glowing like quiet stars above the clipped roses. Here, Emily could let her fingers relax from the tight clutch around her dress hem. Here, no one called her the mistake. At least not aloud. A few feet away, two junior staff whispered while smoking near the path. One of them glanced at Emily and nudged the other, whispering something she couldn't hear but had learned to interpret by instinct. They weren't cruel, not exactly, just participating in the cultural shorthand of the Carrington estate. Identify the weak link. Laugh quietly. Maintain hierarchy. She turned her gaze toward the fountain, trying to recall the last time she had seen her father smile at her without the mask of performance. Maybe never. Her memories of Edward Carrington were always filtered through the cold lens of performance. There was never warmth, only calculation. She had been a disruption to his carefully manicured image since the day her DNA proved what her face could not hide. At 18, that truth had broken the world open. But 10 years later, it still hadn't healed anything. She stepped closer to the marble edge of the fountain and sat. Her heels ached, her mind sharper than ever. Filtered through every moment since she arrived, the calculated jokes, the icy glances, Vanessa's passive-aggressive warpath, her mother's erasure, the gift still untouched, resting among things too expensive to mean anything. She could leave. She thought about it. Standing up, walking to the front gates, calling a captain, disappearing into the night with her pride intact. She'd done harder things, but as the thought rose, something anchored her. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a quiet clarity, the kind that didn't announce itself with a speech or a scream. It simply told her, you belong here, not because they say so, but because your truth does. Behind her, the sound of laughter spilled out from the ballroom. She knew what kind of laugh that was. Not joy. Performance. Every sound in that house was curated to impress or intimidate. And yet, it all rang hollow. Emily stood slowly and made her way back inside. If they weren't going to give her a seat at the table, she would make her own space. She walked deliberately through the corridor, past portraits of Carrington men in oil paint and gold leaf, their expressions all frozen in the same imperial pride. The irony struck her. None of them knew that their bloodline was now carried in the woman they had tried so hard to erase. She re-entered the ballroom just as the master of ceremonies announced the beginning of the presentation speeches. One by one, family members and close associates took the stage to speak about Everett Carrington's life, legacy, and vision. It was all as scripted as theater. Each person recited carefully manicured praise. Everett the visionary, Everett the empire builder, Everett the symbol of American aristocracy. Emily moved quietly toward a side alcove where she could still see and hear without being directly in view. As Edward took the microphone, his voice thick with calculated reverence, Emily felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, recognition. This was the man who had never spoken her name in public. The man who once told a PR team to crop her out of a holiday photo, and now he stood before hundreds, toasting the greatness of a man whose blood ran through her veins but whose protection had never reached her. Edward's speech was polished, full of anecdotes from boarding school days and merger negotiations, none of which had any room for the granddaughter raised on government-subsidized lunches. Emily's phone buzzed softly in her clutch. A message, just 2 words from Lucas. Almost there. She read it twice and then once more. Not because she doubted him, but because even 2 words from him felt like a lifeline. Lucas didn't just see her. He trusted her. He followed her lead in rooms filled with power because he understood that the power she carried wasn't loud. It was elemental. She slipped her phone away and returned her gaze to the podium. Now it was Margaret's turn. Her mother, tall, elegant, glass in hand, eyes that never quite looked at Emily directly. She spoke of grace, of traditions, of upholding the Carrington name through decades of challenge and prosperity. She never once acknowledged the woman standing just feet away, the woman she had carried in her body, hidden from the world, and later dismissed as a paperwork anomaly. Emily listened, not because she needed validation, but because she wanted to remember this moment precisely. Every omission, every denial. She wanted it etched in her memory for what would come next. After the speeches, there would be the gift presentation. That's when Lucas would arrive. That's when the balance would shift. But not because of money, because of memory, because Emily had endured every slight with quiet eyes and steel nerves, and because the gift she carried ignored, laughed at, nearly dropped was more valuable than any Rolex or ruby-encrusted sculpture. She moved through the crowd as the speeches wrapped. Someone tried to hand her a drink. She declined with a nod. Another guest looked at her and half smiled, perhaps sensing something changing, perhaps sensing that the tide was inching toward a turn. At the edge of the gift table, Vanessa posed for photographs beside her diamond-laced Rolex box. She stood like a statue posed, gleaming, calculated. Emily waited, not for attention, for truth to arrive. And then, in a silence that sliced through the ballroom like a razor, the double doors opened. No announcement, no fanfare. Just the sound of polished soles on marble and the collective intake of breath as Lucas Hale stepped into the room, tall, composed, dressed in bespoke charcoal wool. His presence wasn't theatrical. It was undeniable. His eyes scanned the room once. He didn't pause. He didn't wave. He didn't perform. He walked straight to Emily, not caring who watched, not hesitating. He took her hand and kissed it, not with obligation, but reverence. The room held its breath. Lucas turned, finally, to the stunned crowd. "Apologies for arriving late," he said, voice calm and commanding. "But I was meeting with the Treasury Department. Still, I couldn't miss the birthday of my wife's grandfather." It wasn't a speech. It was a declaration, a rewriting of the room. And in that instant, everything began to shift. The moment Lucas's words fell into the room like a match into dry grass, everything paused. Not the music, it had already stopped. Not the people, they still stood, still breathed, but something deeper, older. Something inside the architecture of the Carrington name itself cracked. Emily didn't move. She didn't need to. Lucas's presence beside her was no shield. It was a mirror. For the first time in that ballroom, the guests were forced to look directly at what they had tried to deny, diminish, and dismiss. The woman in the plain black dress was not an anomaly. She was the future. But the silence didn't hold. It fractured slowly, like an ice sheet beginning to splinter. It began with Edward, her father. His voice rang out too loudly, too quickly. "Well, that's quite the entrance, Lucas. But I suppose even a man like you can't resist our family's traditions." The laughter that followed was thin, brittle. It didn't land. Lucas looked at him for half a second before replying. "Traditions are only worth preserving if they include the truth." He said it gently, almost casually. But it hit harder than any shout. Margaret shifted beside Edward. Her hand gripped her champagne glass like it might save her from drowning. "We didn't know you were coming." "Lucas," she said, voice taut. "Emily didn't mention because I wasn't the surprise." He interrupted, his tone still courteous but unmistakably final. "She is." That broke the room. There was movement, shuffling, the sudden clink of glass against silver trays as servers rebalanced their composure. Vanessa's head turned sharply toward them, her smile faltering at the edges. She recovered quickly, she always did, but not fast enough to hide the tightness behind her eyes. "You've made quite the show," she said as she approached, her emerald gown swishing like a warning. "I hope the board finds your theatrics charming." Lucas didn't even glance at her. His attention was on Emily, whose grip on his arm was loose but firm, like a tether. "I'm not here for charm," he said. "I'm here for clarity." The master of ceremonies, clearly flustered, stepped forward to resume control. And now, as we prepare to honor Mr. Carrington with the gift presentation, may I invite Vanessa Carrington to begin? Lucas said, not raising his voice but cutting through the sentence like a blade. Emily will go first. The crowd stirred, not with cheers, with discomfort. This was not how the ritual worked. The gifts from the favored came first. The outliers, if acknowledged, came last or not at all. But Lucas didn't move to negotiate. He simply took Emily's hand and guided her forward. And when she stepped toward the center of the room, alone, holding that modest box wrapped in craft paper and a pale ribbon, the room seemed to tighten in on itself. Everett Carrington, seated in his velvet chair beneath the central chandelier, leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Emily didn't speak. She didn't preface the gift with a speech or a plea. She simply walked to the table, placed the box down gently, and turned it so the ribbon faced her grandfather. Then she stepped back. "This is for you," she said. "I don't expect it to impress anyone. I only hope it means something to you." Everett said nothing. He didn't need to, because at that moment, James Bernstein, longtime friend of the Carrington patriarch and renowned collector of East Asian antiquities, stepped forward. His silver hair gleamed under the chandelier light as he reached for the box. His hands careful, almost reverent, he undid the ribbon, lifted the lid, and gasped. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it was sharp, clear, and real. This is Burmese jade," he murmured, his fingers brushing the bracelet like it might dissolve. "Not just Burmese, this color, this texture, it's from the Salween Valley, pre-occupation era. And this," he pointed at a tiny symbol on the inner curve. "This is a consecration seal from a Tibetan Lama. This is not jewelry. This is heritage." The room held its breath. Even Everett blinked. Slowly. "Where did you find this?" Bernstein asked, turning to Emily. "Brooklyn," she said simply. "A little antique shop." That answer, spoken without fanfare, landed like thunder. The silence that followed wasn't stunned admiration. It was panic. Because now, every insult hurled at her plain dress, every whisper about her gift being cheap or handmade, became a weapon turned inward on the speaker. Vanessa's mouth opened, but no words came. She was still holding her diamond-encrusted Rolex box, its shine now somehow vulgar in comparison. There must be a mistake, she managed finally. No shop in Brooklyn carries. And yet, Bernstein said, not looking at her. "Here it is." Lucas stepped forward. "There's no mistake." "The only mistake," he added calmly, "was assuming value is tied to price. And that was the second match, the second ignition. The ripple became a current. Edward tried to recover the room. "Well, let's not let sentiment cloud the purpose of the evening," he said, almost cheerfully. "The presentation must go on." But Everett raised his hand. Silence fell, slowly, deliberately. He stood. His movements were slow, but deliberate, and his cane tapped once on the marble floor, and then again, and then a third time. "I have listened long enough," he said, his voice dry but unmistakably commanding. "Tonight is my birthday, and I will speak." Everyone stopped breathing. "For years," Everett said, "I have tolerated a kind of illusion in this house, that bloodlines alone determine value, that polished manners and expensive dresses make you superior." His gaze turned to Margaret, then to Edward, then finally to Vanessa. "But I have watched this girl," he said, gesturing to Emily. "I have watched her arrive quietly, endure cruelty, and still give more dignity to this family than most of you have in your lifetimes." Vanessa shifted her weight. Margaret paled. "So let me be clear," Everett continued. "Emily Carrington is my granddaughter, my blood, my heir. And from this moment forward, anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." The room erupted, not in applause, not yet, but in motion. Photographers turned, guests gasped, staff froze. The weight of the words had mass, momentum, and Lucas, still calm, added the final blow. As CEO of Hale Enterprises, I've just committed a $2 billion partnership with Carrington Capital, he said, voice low and steady. But that deal has one condition. Emily leads it. Every board meeting, every signature. Edward choked on his drink. You can't, I can, Lucas said. And I did. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a shift, the kind that echoes, the kind that rewrites rooms. Emily stood still, her gift no longer modest, her presence no longer quiet. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The truth had arrived. And everyone who had laughed, who had sneered, who had called her invisible, could now do nothing but watch. It didn't take long for the masks to start slipping. Everett's declaration had landed with the weight of legacy. But it was Lucas's business ultimatum that detonated the room. Within seconds, the Carrington elite, once so composed, so invincible, began unraveling. Vanessa was the first to react. Her expression didn't crumble all at once. It fractured in small, precise lines. Her mouth twitched. Her pupils dilated just slightly. Her perfectly postured shoulders dropped half an inch. She still clutched her jeweled gift box like it was a shield, but the light had gone from her eyes. You're joking, she whispered to no one, her voice swallowed by the roar of silence. She turned to Everett as if pleading for a correction, a reversal, anything. But he didn't even glance her way. He was still looking at Emily, and there was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Not affection, not apology, something older, recognition. Margaret stood frozen beside Edward, her fingernails pressing crescent moons into the silk of her clutch. It was the first time Emily had ever seen her mother without poise, without a prepared expression. And in that stillness, something subtle but seismic began to shift. Across the room, whispers sharpened into fragments of panic. She's taking over the deal. Hair since when? $270 billion. Does that mean the guests, once proud witnesses to another Carrington gala, were now silent spectators to a dynasty's reordering? And then the press started moving, not slowly, not cautiously, aggressively. Photographers swarmed toward Emily. Not Vanessa, not Margaret. Emily. The woman they had ignored, mocked, cast aside. Flash after flash burst like lightning around her face. And still she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stood, shoulders squared, spine straight, lips composed into a calm that now read not as submission, but sovereignty. The shift wasn't just symbolic. It was structural. Power, once distributed along ancient bloodlines and manicured reputations, had moved, and everyone knew it. Richard Voss, the hedge fund manager who had laughed about her thrift store dress, turned ashen. He stepped back from the crowd, adjusting his tie, trying to edge out of frame, but it was too late. A reporter had already captured the moment his smug smirk turned sour. Another guest, the congressman's daughter who had ridiculed Emily's gift earlier, stared down at her cocktail like it might offer an escape. The tech mogul who had joked about pawn shops and scams was now whispering urgently into his phone, no doubt begging PR to clean up his mess. Emily watched them all, not with vindication but with clarity. These people had built their entire self-worth on exclusion, on who was allowed in, who was cast out. Now, the gate they had guarded for decades had been kicked open, but the shift was far from over. Clara Holt, the senior butler who had directed Emily toward the service entrance earlier, tried to slip into the shadows. She smoothed her uniform, adjusted her posture. But one of the event photographers caught her retreat and raised his camera. Clara paused mid-step, then turned around, her face a mask of neutral professionalism. But Emily saw the tension in her jaw, the regret that curled at the corners of her eyes. Evelyn, the senior maid who had mocked Emily by suggesting the kitchen needed help, stood at the edge of the dessert table, hands clasped in front of her apron. Her smirk was gone. Her eyes flickered toward Emily, then immediately away, as if looking too long might invite judgment or accountability. Emily did not call them out. She didn't need to. The room was doing it for her. And then, in a move no one expected, Vanessa stepped forward. Her heels echoed across the marble like gunshots. She moved fast, cutting across the floor toward Emily. The guests held their breath. This was the part in their minds where Vanessa would reclaim the moment, deliver some blistering monologue, reclaim her spotlight. Instead, she stopped short of Emily and whispered, not loud enough for the crowd to hear, but loud enough for the front row. You've always wanted this, haven't you? Emily met her gaze calmly. No, she said. You just never believed someone could want the truth more than a title. Vanessa didn't respond. Her fingers clenched around the box. Then she turned, briskly, and disappeared toward the stairwell, her entourage scrambling to follow. Her departure wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. A quiet surrender dressed in emerald silk. Margaret and Edward were next. They didn't flee. Not yet. They stood, stunned, whispering furiously to one another. But their eyes no longer scanned the room for support. They knew the optics. They knew the damage. And for the first time in decades, they had no script to read from, no PR team waiting in the wings, no legacy left to borrow. Lucas moved beside Emily again, placing a hand gently at the small of her back, not to lead, not to protect, but simply to affirm. Are you ready? He murmured. For what? She asked. To lead. She inhaled slowly, not to steel herself, but to accept. Yes. And then Everett, still standing beneath the chandelier, raised his cane and tapped it once more. Let it be known, he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. Emily Carrington is now the executive representative of the Carrington family in all matters of estate, public image, and corporate relations. Gasps rippled through the room like a second explosion. The implications were immediate. Social invitations would change. Board appointments would shift. Media alliances would realign. And those who had once toasted to Vanessa, Margaret, and Edward now scrambled to recalibrate. Reporters rushed forward. Emily, what are your first plans as the new executive face of Carrington Capital? How will this affect the merger with Hale Enterprises? Is it true you were denied recognition for 10 years? Emily raised her hand. Calm but firm. Tonight is my grandfather's birthday. That is all I will say for now. The restraint only made them want more. But she didn't give in. Power wasn't performance. Power was choice. And she had already chosen the high road. As the crowd began to disperse into smaller knots of disbelief, admiration, and whispered apology, Emily turned toward the gift table once more. The jade bracelet still rested in its box, its green surface glowing under the soft light. Bernstein stepped beside her and said quietly, You understand what this piece means, don't you? I think that I'm starting to, she replied. This kind of jade, he said, was given to monks and warriors. It symbolized clarity, endurance, and legacy. It chose its bearer. She nodded slowly. Then I'm honored. From the far side of the ballroom, a server who had earlier sneered at her approached hesitantly, holding a glass of water. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Mrs. Hale, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Emily accepted the glass and looked him directly in the eye. It's never too late to start seeing people clearly. He nodded, then stepped back, his shoulders heavier with awareness. As the quartet resumed playing, the ballroom began to move again, but the rhythm had changed. Emily didn't just exist in the space now, she defined it. The whispers would turn to headlines. The slights would become cautionary tales. The woman they had tried to erase was now the name their future depended on, and the night wasn't over yet. The ballroom had not truly recovered from the seismic shift of Emily's rise. It had only begun to settle into a new shape, one reshaped by her silence, her resilience, and the brutal truth now made public. But just as the murmurs began to dull and the string quartet cautiously resumed their sonata, the estate trembled again, this time, not from scandal, but retribution. Lucas had remained quiet after Everett's pronouncement, his presence already a statement in itself. But now, with the room subdued and raw, he stepped forward once more. His tone had changed. It was no longer the gentle composure of a supportive husband. It was something colder, something steel-edged, as if the gloves of diplomacy had been quietly removed. Before the evening proceeds, he said, standing beside Emily, there are matters that must be addressed, not for vengeance, for clarity. The room hushed again, some guests straightening, others fidgeting with the glasses or jewelry, anything to occupy their hands while their minds raced. Lucas tapped a small device in his pocket, and from somewhere at the edge of the ballroom, one of his security aides appeared, carrying a sleek, black tablet. Lucas took it, activated the screen, and turned it to face the crowd. "You see," he continued, voice level, "Carrington Capital is entering the largest private merger in its history. But that merger is contingent upon transparency, accountability, legacy rooted in integrity, not performance." He paused. "And the first step in honoring that legacy is removing what corrupts it." The tablet screen lit up behind him. Now mirrored on the ballroom's discrete projection system, names appeared. A list, one by one: Vanessa Carrington, Margaret Carrington, Edward Carrington, Richard Voss, Clara Halt, Evelyn Reed, the congressman's daughter. Several guests audibly gasped. Even Everett's eyes narrowed. "Each name on this list," Lucas said, now pacing slowly before the room, "represents an individual who, over the past 10 years, has participated in acts of active exclusion, reputational sabotage, and personal harassment against Emily Carrington." He tapped again. Screenshots appeared, snippets of emails, social media messages, text chains, leaked audio files. "You thought your cruelty lived in whispers," Lucas said, almost gently. "But cruelty, like truth, leaves a trail." Vanessa stepped forward, face pale but defiant. "This is character assassination." "So," Lucas interrupted, "this is exposure. The world deserves to see who you are behind the velvet curtains." She turned to Everett, desperate. "Grandfather, this can't stand. This is my legacy too." Everett's response was colder than anything Emily could have imagined. "Legacy is earned, Vanessa, not curated through privilege and disdain." A ripple of tension passed through the room, broken only when a loud voice from the back of the room shouted, "This is a circus, not a celebration." It was Richard Voss. His face was flushed, his posture too rigid. Lucas turned slowly. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you will be relieved to know this is your last Carrington event. Your hedge fund's access to Carrington Capital's portfolio has been revoked as of 1 hour ago. Check your email." Voss's phone vibrated in his jacket. He pulled it out with trembling hands, read the screen, and dropped it into a champagne glass. The sound of the splash echoed across the now silent floor. Clara Halt tried to step backward, but another screen appeared. It showed footage, subtly captured audio from the hallway earlier in the evening. Her voice, "We don't allow such guests in the main hall." A wave of realization crested across the audience. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Margaret finally spoke. "This is excessive," she said, voice shaking. Emily could have simply addressed us in private. Emily, standing tall beside Lucas, finally raised her voice again. "You had 19 years to speak to me in private. You chose silence. You chose shame." Her words weren't angry. They were factual, and somehow that made them sharper. Lucas stepped back, letting the room digest every word. Emily looked out at them, at the people who had once dismissed her as background noise. "You taught me that elegance was in appearances, that power came from names and placements and who stood beside you at charity galas," she said, "but you were wrong. Power comes from knowing who you are when the world tells you not to exist." The staff who had once snubbed her now stood still, no longer shielded by distance or uniforms. Evelyn Reed's face was blank, but her hands trembled. Emily turned toward them, not with hatred, but with finality. "You are no longer my shadows. You are history." Lucas tapped once more. Security personnel began moving quietly, efficiently, one by one. The names on the screen were escorted toward the exits. No shouting, no drama, just inevitability. Vanessa's voice cracked as she was ushered out. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I was born for this house." Lucas turned to her as she passed. "Then maybe you should have learned how to keep it standing." The room remained frozen as they left. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent, as if the estate itself was holding its breath. Everett slowly approached Emily. His gait was slow, but his focus unshaken. He stopped before her and placed one hand on her shoulder. "You've done what none of us could," he said. "You reminded this house what truth feels like." She nodded, but did not smile. "I didn't come for a title," she said. "I came to stop pretending I didn't exist." He blinked slowly. Then, without a word, he took a step back and raised his cane toward the ceiling. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, the quartet stopping playing. The estate paused, and then Everett turned toward the master of ceremonies and gave a nod. The announcer cleared his throat. But for once, there was no need to exaggerate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice shaky but proud, "Carrington Capital is proud to announce its new leading executive partner and official family representative, Emily Carrington." The applause was slow at first, unsure, but then it rose. Genuine, thunderous, echoing through marble and memory. Emily did not bow. She did not wave. She simply stood, her head high, beside Lucas, beneath the chandelier that once cast her in shadow. Now, it framed her in light. What followed was not a celebration. It was a reckoning dressed in formality. Those who had once tried to erase her were now replaced. And those who had stayed silent were left to reckon with the price of their complicity. But through it all, Emily remained steady, not because she had won, but because she had never played their game to begin with. The estate didn't feel the same after the exits. It didn't smell the same. The air had shifted, cleared of the invisible weight of old entitlement, arrogance, and brittle hierarchy. It was as if the mansion had exhaled for the first time in decades. The chandeliers still sparkled. The quartet resumed playing something soft and hesitant, and servers moved carefully along the edges of the ballroom. But nothing about the evening returned to its prior order. That version of the Carrington estate was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar, honest, uneasy, free. Emily stood near the head of the room, no longer an ornament or an afterthought, no longer the shameful secret or the charity case behind the curtain. She stood as the axis around which everything else now turned. She hadn't changed her dress. She hadn't added jewelry or switched her heels. She was still wrapped in black simplicity. And yet, she looked entirely transformed. Across the room, figures who had once looked through her now approached in slow, cautious steps. A woman in pearls, someone who had spoken to Vanessa earlier in a hushed tone about Brooklyn simplicity, cleared her throat. "Mrs. Hale," she said softly, "I just wanted to say, I misjudged. Your composure this evening has been exemplary." Emily met her eyes, not with warmth, but with precision. "Thank you," she said. "Though I never came here to be exemplary, I came to be included." The woman's smile faltered, then stiffened. She nodded and retreated, her apology insufficient but spent. More followed. A senator's wife apologized for her earlier remark about Emily's dress being unsuited for legacy photos. A former Carrington board member extended a hand and said he hoped to build a new understanding. One by one, the apologies came. Not all were sincere, many were strategic, but none could undo what had been done or what had been exposed. Emily accepted each one with dignity, never lowering herself to the small satisfaction of revenge. She understood now that true power didn't need to humiliate in return. True power stood unmoved while others unraveled. She hadn't just survived the Carrington family, she had outgrown them. Lucas watched from the side, his expression unreadable but proud. He didn't insert himself into these moments. He had fought the war he needed to fight, now he let her lead. He knew that his presence had helped crack open the old structure, but it was her presence, her silence, and her endurance that had demolished it. And in the aftermath, it was her grace that rebuilt something new. Everett Carrington had disappeared from the ballroom shortly after his announcement. Not vanished, not hiding, just gone to observe from a different vantage. Emily found him seated alone in the estate's old library, glass of scotch in one hand, cane resting against the oak table. The fire in the hearth flickered low. She stood at the doorway for a moment before entering. He didn't look up. "You're not like them," he said finally. "I used to think that was the problem." Emily moved closer, but didn't sit yet. And now I see that it's the only thing that may keep this name alive. She let that sit for a moment. That's not what I came for. She said, I never asked for the name, just the truth. The name is yours whether you carry it or not. Everett said, but what you've done tonight, it's more than truth. It's a course correction. He gestured for her to sit. She did. You know, he continued, I always suspected, even before the DNA test. There was something about the way you looked at this house the first time, like you saw it all for what it really was. Not just the glamour, the rot underneath. Emily folded her hands in her lap. I was taught not to look away from what's uncomfortable. It's how I survived where I came from. Everett nodded. You'll need that skill, more than ever now, because they'll come for you. She tilted her head slightly. They already did. And now they're gone. No, he said. I mean the others. The ones outside these walls. The press, the investors, the silent enemies who hate that the game has new rules. She didn't flinch. Let them come. I don't hide anymore. He gave a quiet, gruff laugh. You sound like your grandmother. The mention made her throat tighten slightly. You knew her better than I deserved, he said. She saw through all of us too. And when she died, I thought I'd buried that honesty with her. Until you, Emily let the silence stretch between them. Then she said, you could have acknowledged me sooner. He looked down into his glass. Yes, I could have. The admission wasn't enough, but it was something. When she returned to the ballroom, the energy had shifted again. The guests now gravitated toward her, not like moths to a flame, but like planets adjusting to a new center of gravity. A junior staff member approached her shyly, a girl, no older than 19, who had earlier laughed at a joke about Emily's gift. Mrs. Carrington, the girl said, using the name as if tasting it for the first time. I hope one day I can be as calm as you were tonight. Emily smiled, gently. It's not calm, she said. It's knowing who you are. That does the rest. The girl nodded quickly and stepped back, her face flushed with respect, perhaps even shame. Later, as the final hour of the gala stretched, Lucas joined her again. He leaned in close. Your gift, he whispered. It's reshaping everything. She turned to him, amused. You mean the bracelet? He said. You. She looked toward the gift table. The jade bracelet was still there, still untouched by greed, still glowing under the softened lights like a memory you couldn't bury. Funny, she murmured. All that power in something so small. Exactly, Lucas said. That's how you've always been underestimated. Until now, she added. He nodded. The final toast was raised by one of the estate's oldest allies, a man who had remained mostly silent throughout the chaos, but now stepped forward with quiet reverence. He didn't toast Everett. He toasted Emily, to the woman who reminded us that blood does not define value. He said, but that courage, truth, and silence held with dignity, those are the marks of leadership. The clinking of glasses was subdued but genuine, no performance, no pretense. Just a strange, raw admiration that had never been expected. Certainly not earned in the traditional Carrington way, but demanded by the force of truth. As the guests began to depart, each departure felt like an exhale. Emily stood near the grand doors, offering nods and small thanks. She didn't need to charm. She didn't need to flatter. Her presence was enough. When the last car pulled away, when the estate finally quieted, she turned to Lucas. He took her hand. Ready to go home, he asked. She looked around, not at the chandeliers or marble, but at the space between them, the air, the stillness, the silence she had filled with meaning. I already am, she said. And then they walked out, not as guests, not as interlopers, not as figures in the margins of someone else's legacy, but as the center of a new one. As the Carrington estate emptied and the final notes of the quartet dissolved into stillness, a strange kind of peace settled over the ballroom, one not born of celebration, but reckoning. Outside, the spring night carried a crisp wind through the sprawling hedges, scattering petals from the white camellias lining the walkways. as if nature itself had joined in the quiet undoing of an old order. Inside, only a few remained. Emily stood alone now beneath the main chandelier, its light no longer cold and distant, but warm, almost intimate, casting a soft halo over the jade bracelet still resting in its box. Everyone had left but her and Lucas, and for a few minutes, even he had stepped away to speak privately with Everett. She didn't need to listen to know what the conversation was about. The transfer of power wasn't simply ceremonial. It would come with meetings, signatures, press releases, new alliances, and many old ties being severed behind the scenes. But this silence, this moment was hers. She walked slowly toward the far end of the ballroom, past portraits of ancestors who would never have accepted her, past the table where earlier someone had nearly knocked her gift to the ground. Her fingers touched the edge of the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered crest of the Carringtons. That crest once felt like a wall. Now, it was simply history. At the back of the room, near the towering windows that overlooked the estate's western grounds, a sliver of moonlight cut through the glass and landed at her feet. She stepped into it. The past year had tested her in ways she'd never spoken aloud, not even to Lucas. Navigating the Hale boardroom while whispers of her illegitimacy circulated through New York's elite. Handling executives who praised her to her face while doubting her every number behind closed doors. Surviving dinners where her name was never spoken, only implied through passive remarks about outsiders and the untrained. She had been tested not in fire but in frost. And tonight, that frost had finally cracked. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Lucas. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, looking out through the glass as she did. "It's quiet," he finally said. "It won't be for long," she replied. "Tomorrow, they'll start spinning the story their way. Some will call it a betrayal of legacy. Others will say it's about business, not blood." Lucas turned to her. "And what will you say?" She looked down at the jade bracelet still glowing faintly beneath the chandelier. "I'll say the truth doesn't care what they think. It just waits." And tonight, it stopped waiting. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. She knew he understood. "Everett wants to announce the new leadership structure at the Global Investor Summit next week," Lucas said after a beat. "He wants you at the center of it, not just as family, as strategy." Emily nodded slowly. "Good. Then let's give them something they can't erase." "You're ready?" Lucas asked. Her answer was immediate. "I've been ready for 10 years. They just didn't see it. They do now." She turned to face him fully. Eyes steady. "Lucas, I want to change how this house treats power. Not just who holds it. I want new rules. I want legacy to mean something earned, not inherited. I want to remove the gate and build a threshold. If someone's willing to walk through with integrity, they belong here." His smile was soft, proud. "Then you'll do more than inherit this family. You'll save it." The word save rang in her ears longer than expected. She thought of Margaret not as the woman who had disowned her, but as the woman who had once carried her. She thought of Vanessa not as a rival, but as a symbol of a system built on image over substance. And she thought of herself once an Arizona girl, staring through the window of a life that didn't feel like it was meant for her. Now she was the window. A sudden knock at the far door startled them both. It was Everett's assistant, a tight-lipped man named Gerald, who rarely spoke more than necessary. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, eyes lowered. "Your grandfather would like a final word before he retires for the night." Emily gave Lucas a glance before following Gerald into the West Wing. They passed closed doors and darkened corridors, each one echoing with history she had only recently been allowed to claim. When they reached the study, Everett was seated in a high-backed chair, firelight dancing across his weathered features. He didn't smile, but his nod was deep, measured. "Sit," he said. She did. "I'll be blunt," he began. "We both know I allowed things to happen that never should have, but I won't grovel for redemption. I'm too old and too aware that remorse is rarely clean." She watched him carefully. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for accountability." "Good," he said, "because I need to tell you something that no one else knows. Not Margaret, not Edward, not even Lucas." Her heart tightened. "Go on." Everett leaned forward. 29 years ago, I received a call from a hospital. There had been a switch, 2 infants, 2 bassinets. I was told the details, but I was also told that the other family, the one who had raised Vanessa, had already bonded, had already claimed her. I chose not to intervene. I knew which child was mine. I chose silence because I was afraid of what the truth would do to this family. He paused. And then, Anne, when you arrived at 18, with your papers and your quiet defiance, I saw what I had buried. You were the Carrington. Not the girl upstairs playing legacy like a role, but you. And I watched, every year, as you returned, not because you were welcome, but because you were unwilling to let us define your worth. Emily sat very still. So you've always known, yes, he said. And now I want you to understand this. What you do next will define us. The Carringtons may survive scandal, but we have never survived truth. You can change that. She stood slowly. Then I will. And the others, he asked. Vanessa, Margaret, Edward. They'll define themselves through what they rebuild or refuse to. He nodded, satisfied. Go, rest. Tomorrow. The headlines begin. She left the study without another word, her heart heavy but steady. Lucas waited at the end of the hall, eyes searching hers. She gave a small nod. Let's go home. They exited through the front doors, this time not the service path, not the side driveway. The same door she had entered under a cloud of whispers, now opened wide for her under a sky of stars. As the black car pulled away from the estate, Emily looked back once, just once, not out of sentiment, out of clarity. The girl who had walked in earlier that night was gone. In her place was the woman who had outlasted shame, rewritten legacy, and turned silence into fire. They used to call her the outsider, the mistake, the burden, but they were wrong. The real mistake wasn't hers. It was theirs, because they mistook survival for surrender, humility for weakness, and silence for absence. And by the time they understood, it was too late. Emily Carrington didn't break into their world. She became its future. And the estate, no longer a monument to perfection, was now a symbol of rebirth, legacy. After all, isn't what you inherit, it's what you demand the world to remember.